So just by way of introduction, I'm Yani Hamdani. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. I'm also an occupational therapist. And today I was invited to present some of my PhD research, which I finished last year through the Developmental School of Public Health at U of T, University of Toronto, in which I examined how transition to adulthood for youth with disabilities is problematized, or in other words, how it is constituted as a particular kind of problem in Ontario policies and the implications for young people with developmental disabilities and their parents. And as I will explain, problem is in quotes because I suggest that policy issues are understood and given shape in particular ways through the policy-making process. Ding, Lisa. Next slide. So my interest in this topic arose out of my experiences working as an occupational therapist at Bloorview Kids Rehab, which is now called Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, as an occupational therapist developing transition programs and working in transition clinics, just like many of you. However, I began to question the aims and the outcomes of these programs as there was very little evidence about what constitutes a successful transition to adulthood, other than looking at some indicators such as being linked between pediatric and adult health services. Next slide. I also began to question what problem are transition policies and programs aiming to solve and why. So in Ontario and in other regions, the problem is predominantly framed as a service transition issue, particularly when young people age out of pediatric health services by about 19 years of age and public education by 21 years of age and seek adult-oriented programs and services. So in response, transition policies, practices, and/or recommendations have been developed in a number of sectors. And in Ontario, I looked in my project particularly at 3 provincial sectors, that is rehabilitation, education, and developmental services. Next slide. I was also very interested in what these policies considered and did not consider and what implications this could have for the health and daily lives of young people with developmental disabilities and their families. I was particularly interested in the parents who often provide ongoing care and support to their children with developmental disabilities into young adulthood and beyond. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but just to sort of help set the stage of the sort of position that I was coming from, which is a little bit different potentially for some of the discussions or research that may have been discussed through this community of practice previously. But I became interested in how sociological examinations of transition to adulthood might help me to understand the broader context of transitions. So I took a critical social science approach, guided my research, and the overarching feature of this approach is the rejection of the prevailing notion of science as value-free. Rather, it aims to make social and political values and assumptions explicit or visible in our knowledge or research. So what are the implicit understandings about things such as disability and child development that we may take for granted in the way we think about transition? And then to understand how this may have implications for the target population and a policy. This approach also aims to foster social change and to emancipate or change the conditions that potentially marginalize or produce disadvantages for some groups over others, say potentially for disadvantages for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. This approach also aims to examine how dominant ways of thinking about, say, how to be or how to act in society are valued over other ways of being or acting. Say, for example, there's sort of socially valued ways, or normal ways of walking or talking that might be valued over other ways of walking and talking. Next slide. So I drew, just to shed light on sort of a particular policy analysis approach that I drew from. It's called What's the Problem Represented to Be, which was developed by someone named Carol Bakke in Adelaide. And the key ideas of this approach is, first of all, it takes on the critical perspective that I've described. It aims to unpack social values assumptions as well as political ideologies. And it takes a problem questioning rather than a problem solving approach that you would associate with conventional policy analysis. And the main idea is to assess the effects of these assumptions and the way an issue is understood as a problem, and how courses of action that draw on these ideas may have both positive consequences or effects, as well as potentially harmful or even negative consequences or effects for the target population. Next slide. So the basic premise of my research was this: how we think about a problem suggests what we should do about it. However, dominant ways of thinking tend to take hold, which results in benefits or advantages for some people in society, but potentially results in unintended or unanticipated harms or disadvantages for others. Next slide. So based on this conceptual framework, my study aimed to identify and interrogate, or in other words, question the taken for granted assumptions about disability, development, and adulthood that shape how the problem is conceptualized in policies in Ontario, as well as what is proposed to address it, as well as to understand the effects of these assumptions on young people with developmental disabilities and their parents, and also to identify ways of rethinking the problem that can potentially address or mitigate some of the unintended harms or negative consequences on the health and daily lives of young people with disabilities and their parents. And I had a particular interest in the health and well-being of parents. Next slide. So to address these aims, just quickly, I examined 3 documents that I felt reflected the primary or dominant way of thinking about transition in Ontario in the rehabilitation, education, and developmental services sectors, as well as interviewed 13 parents of young people with developmental disabilities. Next slide. So kind of putting, is this the cart before the horse? I'm going to sort of overview the key findings before I talk a little bit more specifically. But generally, overarchingly, what I found is that underlying ideas or assumptions about normal, quote-unquote, normal ways of being, becoming, and acting as an adult citizen were embedded in transition policies, and also in the ways that parents talked about their transition experiences for their children. And these assumptions reflected the high social value we place in society on a particular kind of adulthood that is generally characterized as being independent, productive, being employed, which had both benefits and unintended harms for youth with developmental disabilities and their parents. So for example, policies shaped by these assumptions had some positive effects for sure. For example, young people as well as their parents had feelings of self-worth for achieving or approximating roles and activities that were socially valued in adult life, such as employment, working towards becoming independent, and also a sense of belonging and participating in the world. But they also had some unintended negative effects. For example, experiences of marginalization and social exclusion for both the young people and their parents, whose life courses, the parents' life courses were also changed because they had continued to provide support for their young people into adult life compared to maybe peers of young people who had children without disabilities. So their life courses changed, which meant they maybe were not able to maintain employment, they deferred their own retirement, etc., which I'm going to talk a little bit more, but also had some psychological and emotional harms for families as far as stress, fatigue, and anxiety for parents who supported the young people in pursuing transition goals for their children and whether they achieved them or not. So that's sort of the overarching finding. Next slide. But to put it in a more positive a light, when discussing on these negative harms related to transition policies that are very well intended, there are opportunities to rethink the problem in ways that can potentially address or mitigate some of the unintended harms that also maybe embrace diverse ways of being and doing adulthood. So now what I thought I'd do is take a look at some examples from the documents that I examined, as well as the parents' quotes that kind of reflect these findings, and hopefully this will help give us some foundation for some discussion. Next slide, please. So in the rehabilitation sector, I selected a document that Jan Willem will be familiar with, and also to note that Jan Willem was actually the external examiner in my PhD defense. so he had lots of things to say and has helped develop my thinking even more since I began this research. So I selected a document called The Best Journey to Adult Life for Youth with Disabilities, which many of you may be familiar with. It was developed through the leadership of the CAMH Center for Childhood Disability Research, specifically to address the transition to adulthood across the continuum of rehabilitation services. Next slide. So in the document, one of the areas suggested to address is the idea of supportive environments, and it's proposed as a way to address the problem of transition. For example, the document states that a supportive environment can provide the tools and resources that an individual needs as they prepare for their transition journey, and also to make a smooth landing at their destination of choice. And I think many of us probably on the call would identify and recognize the environment and supportive environments as being an important part of the transition process, and particularly maybe drawing from the biopsychosocial model, the ICF, etc. So drawing attention away from fixing the individual per se, but addressing the environment. So based on this idea of supportive environment, the recommendations focus on addressing environmental factors such as building the capacity of communities to support young people and linking families to system navigators. And while these recommendations do appear to draw attention away from the young person and his or her impairments as the main or only cause of disability and challenges with transitioning to adulthood, one comment that could be made is that the document does focus specifically on youth with disabilities, implying that their transitions are problematic in some way compared to another group, presumably youth without disabilities. So this suggests an idea that some forms of transition are potentially preferred or idealized over others, and that changing the environment to achieve or approximate this ideal transition is the best course of action. Maybe directs attention away from considering other ways of transitioning, other forms of transitioning, or other ways of living an adult life, or maybe even not transitioning at all. It's part of our critical reflexive practice as researchers and clinicians. What are we saying? Why do we value what's so important about transition, I guess? What happens if someone doesn't transition, has challenges transitioning? What would that look like? Next slide, please. However, to its credit, this document does aim to reframe ideas about achieving roles and activities associated with a typical adulthood. For example, in the document it states that the goal of transition should not be focused on a series of outcomes such as employment, independent living and hobbies, but rather active citizenship and involvement in meaningful occupations. So I really like this idea, the goal of active citizenship, because it was very unique and is not commonly discussed as an outcome of healthcare transition in the literature. However, what is meant by active citizenship is not explicitly described, thus it's left open to interpretation and maybe needs some further development per se. Descriptor active potentially suggests that a particular type of citizen is socially valued and preferred compared to, say, an inactive or maybe even a passive citizen. Thus, the idea of active citizenship potentially carries with it expectations for participating as an adult in specific ways that are generally but not only associated with particular roles, activities, and responsibilities, and maybe creates this idea of a hierarchy that, socially preferred ways of being an adult are associated with employment and independent living, and potentially devaluing other ways. And this is sort of an area that I know Jan Willem would probably suggest that this is where there's some shifts in rehabilitation and in thinking about the aims of rehabilitation and linking it to things like fun, fitness, family, function, etc. And so those are potential considerations for rethinking what the outcomes are of transitioning to adulthood. Next slide, please. So interestingly, from the parents' perspective, when I ask them about healthcare transitions, for the most part, they describe their children to be in good health and linked to adult services, which is good for this group to know. However, the parents did spend significant time discussing their early healthcare experiences, which involved measuring, assessing, and managing their children's health and development. For example, Linda described her early experiences with her son who has autism. We had concerns about him, He was late to walk. He still is somewhat low tone. He's kind of loosey-goosey. He was not talking a lot. He wasn't hitting all those markers. So from the beginning, Linda's son was judged and compared to normal markers of development, which then had effects of shaping her conduct towards minimizing and preventing her son's disability and difference to the extent possible over his life course, and potentially opens a discussion about what are some other ways of working with families in the early stages of development that is not so focused on fixing impairment, fixing abnormal development. Next slide, please. Transition Planning, a Resource Guide, is a document published by the Ministry of Education. Its explicitly stated purpose is to facilitate transition planning from school to work, further education, and community living, particularly for exceptional students. And just to note that these are students who have been formally identified as having intellectual, physical, or other impairments that are deemed to require specialized education beyond what's provided in a regular education program. So interestingly, gifted students are also identified as exceptional students, yet the Transition Planning Resource Guide is not transition planning is not a mandatory part of their individual education plan, yet it is for disabled students with disabilities. Thus, the explicit problem of transition in the document carries with it an implicitly understood problem of youth who have disabilities and potentially their inadequate transition to social roles and activities as problematic upon leaving high school. Next page, or next slide, please. A particular understanding of what constitutes a proper adulthood underpins how the issue is understood, or how the problem is understood, and is reflected in statements such as, almost all students will need or wish to engage in productive employment, supportive employment, or meaningful volunteer work. And suggested transition goals include independent living in the community and daily living skills for independence. So these statements suggest the relative importance and value placed on these particular traits and activities in adulthood, to which all students are expected to work towards, to aspire towards, and achieve, or at least approximate. And they reflect sort of taken for granted assumptions about sort of what an ideal adulthood would look like. Ideally, you're working towards or achieving an adulthood characterized by employment, productivity, and independence. And these things aren't necessarily bad, but as I'm hoping I'm sort of leading to, is that it potentially poses advantages to some students and potentially disadvantages to others. Next slide, please. So the parents pursued these transition goals of school to work, employment, meaningful volunteer work to the extent possible for their children. For example, as Evelyn described, it's always the same route. You graduate from high school and you continue on with education in school to have some training in order to position yourself in society. So her comment revealed this inherent assumption that the same route or trajectory from school to further education and eventual employment was expected for every student. And moreover, it was important to pursue this path to establish oneself socially and financially in adult life. However, she did not question this idea or consider if another route might be more realistic, healthy, feasible, or even better for her daughter. Rather, her account reflected, her quote reflected that she had internalized these deeply ingrained social values and beliefs about a productive, independent adulthood, and this shaped her transition planning goals toward these ends. Next slide, please. And then finally, in the developmental service sector, there's a document that's still sort of circulating and they're working on, but at the time, this is the document that I analyzed in my dissertation. It's a provincial transition planning framework, which was developed by the Ministries of Community Social Services and Children and Youth Services in response to an explicitly stated problem of lack of planning and inadequate transition support. And the purpose is to foster a smooth transfer to adult services and a good transition experience, specifically, and this document is specifically for young people with developmental disabilities. So on the surface, the problem is construed as a service transition issue. Next slide, please. Upon further reading, the document states that transition planning should help the young person prepare for adulthood and to plan for adult services in a manner that promotes social inclusion, greater self-reliance, and as independent a life as possible. So what is meant by these terms is not explicitly described in the document. Rather, their meanings are somewhat assumed or implied. And so, for example, my analysis revealed that a focus on independence reflects a socially valued trait of adult citizens, but however implies that dependence is less desirable and to be avoided. So this implicit understanding of independence and self-reliance as socially valued traits function to represent youth with developmental disabilities as problematic in some way because of their risk of being reliant on others and dependent in their adult lives. Next slide, please. So the parents, going back to the parents' quotes and comparing to the parents, what they said, parents reproduce ideas of pursuing independence to the extent possible for their children. However, they reformulated meaning from the conventional thought idea of independence to reflect their circumstances. So for example, Jane stated that it's kind of ironic, but for Joy to become more independent as she gets older, she's also going to have to become more codependent with other people. And similarly, Daniel discussed how he envisioned a supported life independent of us. We'll still be a part of it for his daughter. So what's interesting in these quotes is these parents' quotes reflect a view of independence that it's not about their daughters doing things for themselves in common use of the word, but rather about shifting their dependence to other people and support. Potentially this is an area for us to think about in how we use the word independence and how that may potentially overlook other ways of being, such as being interdependent or even dependent on others. And so how might that shape the way we think about transition policy and practice? Next slide, please. So the parents also shed some light on the effects of transition planning on their lives. So for example, this is a nice quote that sort of reflects the parents' quotes overall, is that we do need transition as far as planning and support. As parents, at the time when you're most tired, everything stops. Special services at home gets yanked, and if you're lucky enough to get it now at 18, and school stops. You just enter a wasteland at the time that you need the supports most psychologically. So this type of quote, I'm sure many of you are familiar with your work with young people and their families. It's the idea of falling off the cliff, feeling that there aren't the service and supports that they need once their young person is no longer eligible for children's services. So in this excerpt, or this quote, Linda describes the significant fatigue, uncertainty, and distress she experienced even with transition planning and support. She also, the parents as a whole also discuss other consequences of transition planning and supporting their young people for their lives, such as deferring their own employment, future retirement, and social time with their own friends in order to support their adult children. So certainly, I would say that many of the policies and practices incorporate the idea of shared management, working with families, family-centered care as part of transition planning, but potentially neglects to consider the life course trajectory of the parents as well. And in Ontario, with the recent Ombudsman of Ontario investigation into situations of crisis for adults with developmental disabilities, it certainly shows that sort of focusing just on that transfer between children and adult services is insufficient from a life course perspective and also the family's life course perspective. Next slide, please. So just to bring it back to the beginning again, just as a review, I provided some examples from the documents and from the quotes from parents, but my analysis revealed that there's this implicit understanding or implicit underlying assumptions about disability, development, and what the proper roles and activities for adults should be in society, that when these assumptions are enacted in policies, they can have some potentially harmful consequences for the health and daily lives of many parents as well as the young people that they support. So we take up some of these ideas in healthcare, education, and social care, but they're not necessarily bad or wrong. But if we're going to incorporate a bit of a critical reflexivity to our transition research and policy and practice, it suggests that we should at least understand that there's social, political, and ideological context that shape some of the ideas that inform our transition work. Next slide. So my findings suggest there are several opportunities to rethink transition to adulthood in ways that might address or mitigate some of the harmful consequences that I identified. So one way could be to embrace disability as a dimension of difference rather than as a problem to be fixed. So a dimension of difference, much like gender, race, or sexual orientation, which could potentially open possibilities for policies that promote positive disability identities. And I think certainly in some of our work in rehabilitation, we sometimes have a bit of a paradox where we're not only supporting young people to address impairment or disability, but we're also sending messages about valuing disability and being a person with a disability in its own right. So if we have these two messages, how do we kind of navigate addressing both these messages in transition policies? In addition, transition policies may unintentionally de-emphasize other possible ways of living a good life as an adult that could be healthier, more feasible, desirable, or even suited to the life circumstances of young people with developmental disabilities and their parents. For example, maybe a stronger focus on roles and activities in adulthood related to making and maintaining friendships, or even working towards work as an end in itself versus trying to achieve working in a training program to achieve competitive employment. So as a point of clarification, I do not want to suggest that pursuing some of the traditional outcomes of for adulthood be abandoned or avoided in policies. Rather, I suggest that a variety of traditional and alternative options for living a good life are supported and given equal attention and consideration in policies, as well as in discussions between youth families and service providers, including discussions about the potential consequences of these options. I would also say that rethinking the issue can also count, as I've mentioned, for the entwined life course trajectories of young people, their parents, and other important people in their lives over the life course. So parents are expected to do extraordinary work to foster as close to a normal life course progression for their children, yet their own life course trajectories are often neglected or left silent in the policies. So a way forward could involve emphasizing family life course transitions and directing more attention to the significant unpaid work that parents and other caregivers do every day to support young people with developmental disabilities. Next slide. So I just thought I would conclude on this note. This is a card I came across when I was in probably what I would call the depths of despair and thinking and writing about my analysis for my thesis. I came across in a shop. It's a card that said, "Adulthood, it's not for everyone." So it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it kind of gave me an aha moment. So more specifically, adulthood of a particular kind may not be available, accessible, or even desired by everyone. So the notion of an idealized form of adulthood characterized by independence and productivity may be beneficial to some people, but may also inadvertently function to marginalize and exclude some people and produce unintended harms for their health and well-being. And that was where I was going to leave it on my presentation. I have a next slide that just talks about future research, but I think we could leave it there because I'm sure we're running out of time and would like to open for discussion and if people have questions at all.
Thank you very much, Yani. That was really amazing and really thoughtful of you to talk to us about your PhD, which maybe at some point you may not want to look at it again. Great way to end.
Absolutely.
I think we certainly can block at least 5 minutes for questions. Maybe the easiest way to do this, Lisa, I don't know if you want to just quickly scroll down a list and see if anybody has a question ready to go, and that will probably save us from talking on top of each other.
Sure.
And I would also even be happy to hear people's comments, because I think, you know, even for me approaching this research after working as an occupational therapist in transition programs, sometimes it felt a little uncomfortable and uneasy trying to question some of the social values and assumptions embedded in our work. And, just people's comments about that or what they think about that would be helpful and interesting to hear too.
Sure. So I'll just go down. Don't feel that you have to say something or that I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm just going to go down your, I'll start with Andrea. Any thoughts, comments, questions?
Not right now, thank you.
Okay. Bianca?
No, thank you for the presentation.
Okay. Arlene?
No specific, excellent presentation, Yani. I suppose you've had me think about the way that disability is, it's helped me reframe the way I think about it, and how to affect policy, I think, is, and re-engaging parents and caregivers in supporting their lives, I think, has always been part of our goal as a healthcare team to support these kids. So it's really just helped me think about it in a different way, and hope that some of the future research that comes out either from you or colleagues is in support of that way of thinking. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Great. I agree.
Dilshad, I don't know if you want to, if you have anything, I guess your audio is not working so well, but if you can just type something into the chat box if you have any questions or comments. So I'll just move on to Jan Willem.
Thank you, Yani, for your presentation. As you mentioned, I had the opportunity to ask you challenging questions, and you answered them really well. Congratulations again on your well-deserved degree. You may come back to it, and it's also on the agenda. I think this work is really interesting when we start talking in our community of practice around indicators of outcome of transition. And to me, it really brings a new lens or a framework that beyond the traditional clinical thinking, at least that I would bring traditionally through my medical training. So thank you for bringing this to our attention and in a very timely manner.
Great. You're welcome. Yes, I think it's tricky, and I've been involved in evaluating transition programs before, and sometimes it really ends up being on like indicators of service versus actual outcomes for the young people and families themselves, which I think is just much more challenging to identify, but maybe we're up for that challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Gail?
I'm just reflecting back on some of the work with the ethics core of NeuroDevNet, now called Kids Brain Health. We did a few years ago. It's led by Eric Racine. And I just have, as I was listening to this whole ethical lens shaping this of doing no harm, but doing the right thing at the right time. The other kind of moving forward reflection I had was with my own work, as I'm working with children with FASD in the foster care system and as adolescents, at that point, often not even connected to a family. When you talked about the piece with the family trajectory, what do we do with a really significant population that doesn't belong to a family? So that's some of my ongoing work and questions.
Yeah, I agree. Right, and I completely agree with you. I mean, certainly my research focused on parents specifically, but we do need to extend our thinking to think about the other important people in young people's lives that will be supporting them, or if they don't have them, like what does that transition look like?
All right, Geraldine, any thoughts or comments?
Thank you, Yani. That was an amazing presentation. As I was listening, I was reflecting a lot on the language that a lot of us use and read about in different documents, and it's certainly got me thinking a little bit more about paying attention to terms and how we word the transition from pediatric to adult care. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Gilles?
Also the same as everybody has said, Yani, great presentation. The only thing I would like to add is it's always a very difficult when you deal with disabilities to transition to adult services, as many others, complex issues. But also, you add on those with disabilities, many of them do have medical issues and have mental health issues, which even complicate the transitioning a whole lot more, because then you're bringing in other kinds of adult resources into play, and sometimes with children and youth, they may all fall under the one roof.
Right.
But it does show the complexity of transitioning, and this is why I'm happy to be on this committee, because there's a lot of discussions and a lot of clarifications and guidelines that have been put forward. But when I hear that too, I'm saying, yeah, it's there's going to be a lot of work in progress, but just wanted to add that part. Oh, and maybe one more part I wanted to add. The one thing I didn't really pick up a lot is, and I know you kind of alluded to it, was, and what I probably hear more about it is, families looking for someone to guide them through the whole process, someone to be in support of the process, and putting maybe a little bit more emphasis on that presenting issues.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And also not just maybe at the sort of focus on this point of transfer between, like baton pass between children's and adult services, but more across the life course, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Alrighty, Karen?
I was just thinking when you were talking, you know, the mother who felt like she basically had all the services stopped at 18 versus, you know, for us to be able to get somebody services, we have to start breaking down what makes them different and how do they, you know, get funding, you know, if they have a disability. And so I'm not sure how we're going to achieve that, because as long as we have to go through that process of, you know, what makes you in need of these services, we're going to continue to identify them as different. So I don't know how you get around that.
Right, yeah. Yes, I agree with you, and it's something I've grappled with too, in taking sort of this the sociological approach, because you're right, many of the criteria for some of the programs and services are, you know, based in very specific criteria related to age, impairment, ability, functioning ability, etc. So I think that will be a greater challenge, because then when we're talking about language, a lot of the language does go, you know, it is important, but yet if the criteria to assess and screen people for services uses this language, then it's always going to sort of position them as problematic in some way, in a sense. Yes, families do need support in order to live well and have good lives. So I think that definitely is going to be an ongoing challenge to think about.
I just was wondering too if you had thought about, you know, how terminology has changed through the years, because I think we've acknowledged that we don't like identifying people as different, you know, so if you're looking at disability or mental retardation or idiocy, or, I mean, we've tried over the years to come up with a different way of speaking, and
yes, yeah,
always returns back to this is a negative connotation for this word.
Right. So I kind of have two comments about that. One is, yes, I agree that the way we thought about things have changed over time, including our language, the way we speak about things, and I think that's important to highlight, is that social change can happen. Things do change over time, the way we think about things. I guess the other thing, which is sort of my idea of embracing disability as a dimension of difference, would be a little bit different. So the idea that within a population there are differences related to gender, race, sexual orientation, disability, and rather than those being problematic, there's something that we embrace as dimensions of difference. So maybe it's just shifting the way we talk about things and promoting positive disability identities as a potential way forward.
Okay, Caitlin?
Oh, hi, everyone, and Yanni. I really, I'm sitting here really scratching my head, because I think it's just made me really think about things differently as we, you know, and just really the definition of how do we define success, and particularly when you're working in the space between clinical service delivery and then moving to advocacy. You know, how do you tell that story about individuals maybe not being ready yet for, whatever it is they're going to do in their adult life. So in terms of the language conversation, we've been using this description of kind of not ready, which, many neurotypical children are not ready for the rigors of adult life either, but particularly, coming from an autism space, we absolutely see individuals who fall off services cliff, as you talk about. And, those things that whatever we call adult successes, living independently, working, or maybe attending post-secondary, which we would call success, and many parents also would call success, our young people with autism, when they leave school at 18, are not ready for that. And so how do we simultaneously support what we think the individual and their families want without labeling them, as in a negative sort of way? So I really appreciate, the opportunity to think about that as we, have to become increasingly careful with our language.
Yeah, and language does matter and does reflect sort of our social values and assumptions that can have effects. I think that would be my overall message. And again, the idea is not to suggest that what we're doing is bad or wrong, but just any way of thinking is going to have benefits and harms for some people. And so as from the standpoint of critical reflexivity, do we at least identify what these potential harms could be, and are there ways to shift thinking or to mitigate those harms in some way? There's never probably be an ideal perfect approach.
Yes, thank you. And just because I've only done a couple of these webinars, is the presentation that's recorded and your PowerPoint will be available after? Is that right, Lisa?
Yes, I do record the presentation, and as long as Yani is okay with me posting it, I'll do that. And I'll send people.
Yep, that sounds good.
Thank you so much.
And Carol, do you have any thoughts or comments?
The part that sort of got me thinking was when we're looking at doing transition and we're looking to get our adult counterparts invested into this, how we look at how we define it and how we look at it as a need will be very important, because the adult services, pediatrics is always, there's always more need than what there are dollars around to service that, but the adult services struggle with that issue even more. So when we're coming to them, looking for them to help support services that we are doing, finding ways that we can really show the value add, and why it's important that we look at it, so that we're not oppressing groups and that we're being inclusive, is very important. And that was a piece that, as Yani was providing her presentation, that kept resonating for me. Because some of the times when I'm working with some of my adult counterparts, they explain to me how they've got so much need with so few dollars to satisfy those needs, and they're not always understanding why this is such a need. So the more that we're able to provide it in a context that can reinforce why this is important, I think it's an important piece overall.
Right, agreed.
And Delapo, are you still on the line?
Yeah, I'm still here. Thanks. I have nothing new to add.
Okay.
Thanks.
Alrighty. Tessa?
Hi. Just kind of echoing what some of the others have already said, I just want to thank you for presenting something that's very practical and yet refreshing. Sometimes in the world of transition you feel like you've heard it all before, so this was a nice way to just stop and reflect and reframe things, so thank you.
Well, thank you.